Alright, guys. So what we're going to do today to kind of kick off Unit 3 is hopefully you've watched the documentary. It's a good primer over the early years of the 1970s. But what we're going to do in this final unit is obviously see how far we can get. So pretty much take the United States into the 21st century. We spent an awful lot of time, admittedly, on, 45 to 70, because I think those years really set up everything that happens before. And in many cases, the things that come after, the events of the 70s, the 80s, are going to look a lot more similar to what we experience today, because it's, in many cases, what we're doing today is the outgrowth of it. And so to really kick that off, we're going to start with the Nixon presidency, because this is a defining moment for the United States. Nixon, remember, is the guy that gets us out of Vietnam. But Nixon always wanted to secure a legacy. Okay? And fair warning, Cold War, Watergate, and there are going to be loads of, Futurama references in this, just because, I love Futurama and I love Richard Nixon. Nixon is pragmatic. Remember that pragmatic liberalism, the idea that he would go with what liberal ideas he had to in order to curry favor, because he realized that staunch conservatism could not work. It couldn't curry enough votes. That America was changing. The 60s, the United States drifts more and more to the left side of the political spectrum. So Nixon wants to be all-inclusive, and he also wants to do this because if LBJ, remember, would get angry if anybody criticized him, okay? That, he wants everybody to approve him. Nixon has somewhat of the same issue. Nixon doesn't so much get angry, but Nixon has a compulsive need to be liked. He has a compulsive need for people to like him, respect him, approve of him. And so, that's going to be his undoing at Watergate. That's why he authorizes the committee to re-elect the president, or CREEP, probably one of the most unfortunate acronyms in the history of ever, to break into the Watergate Hotel. But before we get there, Nixon tries to do so much because he wants to build a legacy where people will look back and say that Nixon was a good president. He is an SOB. He is gruff. He doesn't like everybody. He is very cold, calculating, and scheming. I would be too if my middle name was Milhouse. He doesn't like that, for most of his life, he has never had power. And so now you give this man power, and he wants to hold on to it at all costs. Okay? But in the same way, he's also he's not progressive, but he's not hard-right conservative necessarily either. Okay? He starts what we call New Federalism. And what he tries to do is, this is basically the epitome of states' rights. Transfer a lot of the sovereign power that the federal government now has, okay, and push it off onto the states. Let the states deal with civil rights. Johnson may have campaigned for civil rights. Johnson may have enacted civil rights legislation. But Johnson doesn't necessarily take a step in actually making it come true, forcing the states to desegregate, because he realized that would cost votes. Okay, you need the South. So he pushes that off. Okay, well, we'll have the Civil Rights Act of 64. We'll have the Civil Rights Act of 68, but we'll make it take effect when it's the next guy's term. Let Hubert Humphrey or RFK, or, as it turns out, Richard Nixon, let them deal with it. Well, Nixon has the same problem, but Nixon can't punt anymore, so he pushes it off onto either the Supreme Court or to the states. Let the states take care of it. With the result that by 1969, despite Brown v. Board, despite what's going on with the Greensboro Uprising, 70% of African American students are still segregated. Integration still has not fully happened. Now, under Nixon's watch, that will drop to 18%. But that final, 18, 20%, that's going to linger for quite a while. Okay, again, and I mention, I've had a number of students tell me that they came from high schools that had only fully desegregated, about 10 years before they themselves went to high school. So it's a long process. Nixon speeds it up, but he does so in such a way that if there's, to the north, he can say, well, I desegregated the schools. But to the south, well, I didn't do it. The states did it. Remember, Nixon is the consummate politician. Okay? He will tell you whatever he wants if it will get you to vote for him. Okay? He's not motivated by ideology. Instead, he's motivated by, getting into power and staying there. Now, that's not to say that he doesn't do some good things. He is going to be a strong supporter of women's rights. He'll be the first president to endorse affirmative action. But at the same time, he's going to both decrease the federal government's power as well as centralize power in the White House. He wants the executive branch, need to adjust this, he wants the executive branch to be the most powerful branch of the government. To hell with checks and balances, the White House needs to have a lot of power. So what all this means, okay, is now we can say that finally the progressive era is done, okay? Johnson is the last progressive president. And Nixon, tries to undo some of it. Jimmy Carter, Gerald Ford's really, and we'll get to him. Jimmy Carter's not really going to get that much in the way of reform done. And then starting with Reagan, we get the rise of the new right, which is an outright rejection of the progressive era. American politics, if you look at a lot of times, it's a case of one party, we're going to pass all this stuff. Then the next party is like, well, we're going to undo 50% of that. And then we're going to pass this stuff. So then the first party, when they get back into power, undoes 50% of that stuff. And it's what we call progress. Pardon me for being a little cynical. I've mentioned I'm conservative, so but I thought Bernie Sanders was probably the most honest person trying to run for president. I thought, he stood the best chance at shaking up the political system, and today he has endorsed Hillary Clinton. So you got to question just how sincere, is he? Yes, he has ideas, but he's also a good politician. Now, Nixon, being a good politician typically means play it safe. But Nixon was also, for the time, a little, radical. He wants revenue sharing, okay? And what we mean by revenue sharing is he wants to try to make it where, if the state has a surplus, they can give some to the local and, municipal. Or, if the federal has a surplus, they push some off onto the states. This idea that we all need to work together, and so instead of surpluses, give it to somebody who needs it more. He also wants to cut taxes, which, that's pretty standard, but, the last big tax cuts had been, under Kennedy. This is not necessarily the domain of the conservatives. This is kind of where it starts. But prior to this, most presidents, there's a line from fantastic 1990s movie, I loved it when I was a kid, called My Fellow Americans. And it stars James Garner and Jack Lemmon. And the premise of the movie is one's an ex-Republican president, one's an ex-Democrat president. They have to work together to stop a scandal by the current president. And, it's a comedy. But there's a line in there, and to show you how dated the movie is, he says 180 million people, and now it's 300 million. He says you got 180 million people, you all want different things, and the only thing you can all agree on is you don't want higher taxes. That kind of starts here, where now every president kind of, think it like this. Okay, liberals tend to not want to cut taxes anymore. But they're not going to campaign and say we're going to necessarily raise taxes. They won't get your vote. Now they can say, we'll raise taxes on insert group here, typically now the rich, because most people, will vote for that. But you're not going to get a president that says, I want to raise taxes for everybody, because that would be political suicide. We're going to see things like, the State and Local Assistance Act of 1972, which says, okay, here's $4 billion to match some of your tax revenue, to match certain spending in this area. The government wants to help these states. And that's going to stay on until 86, when Reagan cuts it as part of his way to trim the budget. Okay? Nixon bloats out the budget. Nixon, in part, bloats out a lot of stuff because, again, he believes in something of a more active government. You're going to see, welfare. He wants a new welfare system. And I don't mean scrapping welfare, as you would assume a conservative, but he actually wants, to help. You're going to get things like the family assistance plan. Pay annuities. If, people, single mothers with children or things like that, the government will give them stuff. But it doesn't get off the ground because it's politically unpopular. In fact, the family annuities is so unpopular. Okay, Nixon's welfare plan will wipe out jobs. I mean, this just, people become terrified. And so Nixon, again, being that consummate politician, okay, he has an ideology of what he might want to do, but if it will not get him reelected, he is not going to do it. And so he has no problem letting it just fall by the wayside. Now, we see, so at home, he might be conservative, but at home, he wants reform. But abroad, Nixon's biggest thing is he wanted to be the guy that ended the Cold War. Okay? Vietnam had largely eroded a lot of U.S. credibility in the world. Again, how can we say we're the good guys and the Soviets are the bad guys? Remember that first, second, third world, breakdown when we're bombing the hell out of Vietnam. Well, that's not scoring us any points with third world countries. The civil rights movement and all the various protests, okay, and the fact that a lot of people did not want to give equal rights to African Americans. That's not doing us any favors in Africa. And the Soviets are playing this up, by the way. So Nixon saw that it was his destiny, if you will, okay, his destiny to try to forge a new relationship with the Soviet Union. Which is why, under the aegis of what we call détente, okay, which is détente, it's French, it means the easing of relations or the thawing. It's a period from about, you could say, it's realistically short-lived, only from about 72 to 79, if you want to put a date on it. But it's where the United States and the Soviet Union stop being up in each other's faces. We say we need to work together. So a lot of this, it's Richard Nixon working with Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev. Like here, Brezhnev becomes the first sitting Soviet Prime Minister to come to the White House, come to the United States. And we see, and remember Nixon had gone to, I believe it was 1960, as vice president, went to Moscow, where he engages in what's called the kitchen cabinet debate with Nikita Khrushchev. Okay, what nation can build the greatest, kitchen cabinet, the greatest kitchen, pretty much. Well, now it's a case of, in meeting with Leonid Brezhnev, okay, how can we de-escalate the Cold War? The Soviet nuclear arsenal was growing. Our street cred is gone. By now, it's becoming more and more frequent that American submarines and Soviet submarines that would track each other would run into each other. There's a fear that war might just pop up. There's also the issue, okay, that we need to do something because if you remember Prague Spring, 1968, when the Soviets invade to put down this revolution in Czechoslovakia, and we get the Brezhnev Doctrine, sponsored by this guy. And it's retroactive, but it says that once a nation is in the Warsaw Pact, that it can never leave. Once in, never out. And so this is how the Soviet Union is just centralizing its control of Eastern Europe. Well, this could spark off a new Cold War. There were fears of that. And Nixon says, no, I want to ease relations. Further, Nixon wants to try to go to China. What's the line from Star Trek VI? The old Vulcan proverb. Only Nixon can go to China. Okay? He does so to encourage trade. Remember, up until now, we haven't even acknowledged China exists. It's a giant black hole. I don't know, maybe red hole since it's communist. But we just pretend, no. Taiwan is China, and that mainland stuff, that just doesn't exist. Okay? It's the Great Wall of... Well, now Nixon says, you know what? No. We cannot live in a world like this. It has been almost 30 years. No, 23 anyway. So Nixon will try to seek trade with China. Look at the bottom of your iPhone. Look at the tag on your shirt. Look at who's making your laptop. Made in China. That would not have happened pre-1973. You can thank Richard Nixon for this because in establishing that trade with China, okay, China now becomes central to the American industry, central to the American economy. Because now we are reliant on cheap Chinese goods just as they are reliant on American exports. Now, you would think that, okay, well, this would be popular. We're getting away from, duck and cover. When the bombs fall, or, sometimes there will be a warning. How the hell many times is this going to happen? The fact is, it's not popular at all in the United States. We've been spewing so much propaganda, okay? How can we do this? How can we, the American people, shake hands with the enslaved Soviet people? How can we work with people with so many human rights abuses? Okay? Not to mention things like this. Okay, well, we're going to shake hands with Leonid Brezhnev, each one of us with a fistful of nukes. The thing is, Sorry, I just read the headline, Color, Pat Nixon on tour, new string bikinis. And I really hope that's two different headlines because do you really want to see, an 80-year-old first lady in a string bikini? But that's another story. What we're going to see, okay, is the problem, and this honestly, not to jump ahead, but the Murrah Federal Building bombing, okay, Tim McVeigh in the 90s, okay, you cannot take half a century of Cold War propaganda and then turn it off. You just can't do it. You cannot tell people their entire lives that the Soviets are godless heathen communists, bent on destroying the world and must be eradicated. Better dead than red. Oh, by the way, we're friends with them now. You can't do it, and people will be like, oh, okay, yeah, it makes sense. It just doesn't work that way. Similarly, it's going to be hard for a lot of people to accept when Nixon goes to China in 1972 and meets face-to-face with Chairman Mao. Okay? Nixon is trying his best to ease the tensions between capitalism and communism. To ensure that I won't say he's anti-nuclear. That's more reserved for Ronald Reagan. But Nixon sure as hell realized we don't need half of the world ready to blow up the other half. That's no good for anybody. That's not good for business, as I just turned him into a mob boss. That's not good for business, Brannigan. That's not my original. Oh, Brannigan. There's my Nixon voice. Now just wait till we get to Watergate. Now the trip to China, which was a week from February 21 to 28, 72. Okay? Why he does this is to encourage competition with Moscow. One of the things we didn't talk about is in 1961, there was what we called the Sino-Soviet split. And instead of, the Soviet Union continuing to work with Red China, instead, the Chinese want to go their own way, and they literally tell the Soviets, you're doing Marxism wrong. That is not what Karl Marx went. We're going to do it this way. So Nixon realizes this is a potential win-win. Get trade with China, yay economics, or let the Soviets see we're willing to trade with China, and that will make the Soviets more willing to deal with us. So what this does, it normalizes relations. We encourage U.S.-Chinese trade. And it diffuses tensions. So put an asterisk up here. Diffuses tensions over Taiwan. And I say put an asterisk because we still have tensions over Taiwan. Okay, I just read today, an international court just ruled against China in a dispute in the South China Seas over, territory. The thing is, okay, when I was a kid in high school in the 90s, I read an article that said the United States and China would be at war by 2006. It's been 10 years. Thankfully, that's not happened. But, okay, the fact is, do I think we'll ever go to war? Of course not. Our economies are too intertwined. And, war is, in this case, bad for business. But, okay, there are still those tensions. There's still things. I mean, we're still capitalists. They're still communists. There are tensions. But this goes along, nobody's really worried that at any time, at any date, war is going to break out. We're more worried about North Korea lobbing a missile at South Korea or Japan than we are China doing something. Okay? That does not really exist in the 60s or the 70s. But this normalizes relations. This eases those tensions and puts enough pressure on the Soviets that Nixon can get the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, SALT I. Now, this had begun in 69, but now in 72, now we get this. Now, in part why they do this is, remember okay, Matt, if I fire my missiles, you fire your missiles, we're both dead. Well, there's still those people. Can a nuclear war be won? And so somebody comes up with the bright idea of the anti-ballistic missile. Have a missile to shoot down incoming missiles. If you can make that technology successfully work, and we've tried, we have some good kill rates, but we don't have anything that's, 100% foolproof, at least not to my knowledge, today, let alone in 1970s. But the problem is, if you can do that, if you can successfully destroy any nuclear missile that comes over your territory, what is to stop you from launching against your enemy? If the Soviets can destroy all of our missiles coming in, what's to stop them from launching? Mutually assured destruction no longer works. Missiles lose their deterrent capability. And once you think that a nuclear war can be won, then you're more willing to try. So Nixon, by putting pressure on going to China, as well as this, we get the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, as well as what we call an interim agreement. That the interim, what does it mean? It's short, but it starts the ball rolling. This is what SALT I is. Okay? The Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty said that we would not develop anti-ballistic missiles. And that stays in full effect until the George W. Bush administration unilaterally withdrew from the treaty. This was in effect from 1972 until about 10 to 12 years ago. Now, the interim agreement only lasted about 5 years, but all it pretty much said is, okay, we're going to slow down how many missiles we build. We're going to have something of a construction moratorium. And this is the first time that we start limiting stockpiles, that we start trying to put rules on nuclear warfare. How many bombs can you have? How many bombs can I have? How many missiles? Da-da-da. Now, this doesn't fully last. Okay? The interim agreement only lasts 5 years. It expires in 77. The ABM does last, but it shows we're taking steps. It shows that neither side is really wanting to blow up the other, leading to all sorts of joyous celebrations, such as Nixon continually looking cold and calculating. Leonid Brezhnev is clearly drunk and kind of looks like he wants to whisper sweet nothings into Nixon's ear. These are the first steps. And this is really what Nixon wanted. Think about it. The Cold War begins in 1945. Before, let's take 1970. Let's say 1970. There's no sign of it ending. Okay? Sure, we get sidetracked with Vietnam, but why are we fighting there in the first place? Why are we ignoring our treaty obligations from the 50s to just let them, if they want to unify under the Communist North, so be it. It's not our problem. Nixon wanted to force a change because he realized the Cold War could not go on indefinitely. Now, before you think that Nixon is some sort of hero, and I'm not necessarily trying to rehabilitate Nixon, but the fact is he did do good stuff. Maybe not at home, maybe not with Watergate, but, foreign policy-wise, he did do some good stuff. But don't think that the Cold War is ending by any, no, not by any stretch of the imagination. We get Project Azorian. In 1968, a Soviet Golf-class ballistic, NATO reporting name Golf-class ballistic missile submarine, sank around 1,500 miles off the coast, nautical miles, off the coast of Hawaii. Now, with this submarine, okay, we knew approximately where it was. We had, our SOSUS warning nets. And what we had done, by the way, and I should mention, is in the Pacific and the Atlantic, we actually, on the sea bottom, laid what are called SOSUS nets. And these were sonar nets. So that what we could do, just sonar systems, that what we could do is we could pick up if Soviet submarines were, trying to either enter certain parts of the Atlantic or the Pacific. Okay? We know roughly where the wreck is. August 8, 1974. The Hughes Glomar Explorer, one of the world's largest survey ships, okay, raises part of this submarine. They don't get all of it. I think they literally get just, a few parts, a couple of bodies, stuff like that. But that Cold War is still going. Why are we doing this? We sure as hell don't want to return to the Soviets. We want the submarine-launched ballistic missiles. We want to see what their missile capability is to make sure that our intel is accurate. We want Soviet codes so that we can, determine, make sure that we can intercept and break codes if we need to. This cost $500 million, maybe as much as $800 million, and it's unsuccessful. But why I want to mention this, because I'm going to drift a little aside from the Nixon presidency briefly, is to just continue with this idea of détente. Yes, we're easing relations, but no, the end of the Cold War is nowhere in sight. Sorry about that, had to pause the video briefly. So, if the end of the Cold War is not in sight, though, okay, and this little bit was started during Nixon presidency. I won't spend too much time on it because we already talked about it. But we do have the Apollo-Soyuz test project. Okay, although we're still going to play our clandestine, games. What's the line from The Hunt for Red October? Once more, we play our dangerous game, a game of chess against our old adversary, the American Navy. It's not a speech impediment. I'm Scottish, but with the Apollo-Soyuz test project, this was the United States and the Soviet Union trying, remember this is when they take a Soyuz and they take an Apollo spacecraft, build a mechanism so they can rendezvous in space and hook up. And it was done in some aspects there was some space stuff. Okay, we were able to do joint, space measurements. There were a lot of scientific experiments. I mentioned Mercury astronauts. Before this guy, the gray-haired dude, Deke Slayton, was one of the original Mercury 7, but was never allowed to fly due to a heart fibrillation, and then it magically cleared up, and so they let him go on Apollo-Soyuz, test. Whereas everybody else of his group had flown early in the 60s. This was his, thing. There was also the idea, okay, can we possibly do rescue missions? Can we work together? But the two major impacts of this are this is a symbol of détente. Okay, we've gone from competition, we've gone from wanting to blow ourselves up, we've gone from duck and cover. We don't know when the bombs are going to fall. To hey, we can work together in space. It's also the last manned U.S. space mission until the space shuttle in 1981. And it's actually funny, another funny story about Apollo-Soyuz. And again, that symbol of détente, each side launched with half of this plaque, and then they hooked it up. And again, Alexei Leonov, and then Oklahoman Thomas P. Stafford. But this mission actually had its origins in a movie. There was a movie starring Gene Hackman, and it's called Marooned. And it came out about 1960, I think it was 1969. And it actually aired, I want to say, just before or just after the first moon landing. And it was, okay, what if we had a space station? Okay. And then a crew had been up there for almost a year. They try to come down, and their engine doesn't work, and they get stuck in orbit. Okay, and one of the concepts, and you can even see the Cold War is ending then, because a Russian Voskhod spacecraft changes its orbit, comes over, and helps stabilize the remaining crew until an American rescue mission can get up there. This is one of the first times in, American cinematic history of the Cold War that the Soviets are portrayed as the good guys. Okay? Well, people at NASA saw this movie and they said, hey, I wonder if, and they made it a reality. So even as early as 1969, you can see the Cold War, it's kind of winding down. But Nixon really wants to take that and run with it. He wants to be the one to really end it. And it doesn't happen, unfortunately, spoiler alert, things go great until 1979, when Afghanistan, which had, the Soviet Union had put a lot of time, effort, and resources in there, wants to break away from, that communist influence. And here comes the Brezhnev Doctrine, the Soviets invade, and it kills détente and starts the Cold War anew. But for now, it seems like things are going swimmingly. What would Nixon have to be worried about in an election? But Nixon, wants to hold on to power at all costs. So he creates an organization called the Plumbers. He fears leaks during these various negotiations, both with communists as well as with people whom he is trying to, work with to help him get reelected. A lot of these guys are former CIA. They go to try to help. They go to try to basically... They're supposed to just talk to people. They're not supposed to necessarily do illegal activity. They're supposed to work for CREEP, the Committee to Re-elect the President, which, again, the worst acronym in the history of ever. But then 5 of these plumbers, June the 17th, 1972, break into the Watergate Hotel complex. Why? This was the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee. And they wanted to basically see, okay, what are your plans? What ads are you going to run? What information do you have? How can we use this either against you or to help Nixon? And of course, we all know how, this was spoiled, right? I mean, come on. Damn you, Forrest Gump. But we see here, and this is the Watergate Hotel. And what happens is somebody does find out what's going on. 5 of these plumbers are going to be arrested. And what we see is the money. How are these people paid? It's traced back to CREEP. So then the question becomes, in the words of, to use a Hillary Clinton phrase, which, by the way, Hillary Clinton was actually an attorney working on the Watergate scandal back in the 70s. What did the president know, and when did he know it? Okay. Well, this is what we do know. There was a cover-up. Nixon had kept in Johnson's automatic taping system. Remember the pants thing down where your nuts hang that I shared for Johnson? Sorry, I just realized nuts hang Johnson. Anyways, well, Nixon continued that. And so records almost everything. And in various of those tapes, you can hear Nixon authorizing a cover-up. Telling people, slow down the investigations. Make sure the money can't be traced back to us. Make sure people don't talk. Now, he might not have outright said, cover this up. He might not have, outright implicated himself. But he was, nonetheless, clearly obstructing justice. And then one tape from June 20, 3 days after the breakout, there's an 18-minute gap. Okay? If you want to know why people are so concerned with Hillary Clinton's emails, the fact she deleted, 30,000 of them, okay? A lot of that that fear and paranoia about stuff like that, dates back to Watergate. Which, again, what is the significance of Watergate? We'll get to many of them in a second, but consider this. Anytime there is a political scandal in the United States, the suffix "gate" is added, okay? What is it? Chris Christie, did he... close a bridge in order to, get political revenge. It's Bridgegate. What is it? Hurricane Katrina, Katrina Gate. I mean, anything like that. You add gate to the end of it. But it's this whole thought, if everyone thinks he's guilty and 18 minutes are erased and, he can't say why, right? People start to wonder. The same way that with Hillary Clinton, well, I deleted 30,000 emails, and then, the FBI head says, well, there was actually classified stuff. People start to wonder. Remember, one of the byproducts from the 60s is we no longer, thanks to the credibility gap, we no longer trust the federal government. Simply saying, oh, well, that gap was removed for national security concerns doesn't placate us anymore. We have wised up to that. That is the political reality of the world we're now in. Then in 1973, Nixon begins to fire various aides, fire council members. As more and more details come to light, Nixon starts firing people that were implicated. And so the question becomes, is Nixon doing this because, these people might be guilty, or is Nixon doing it to cover his tracks? And so by the end of 73, a cloud now hangs over the Nixon presidency. And then it only gets worse. Spyro Agnew, before he becomes a headless clone. Agnew, in the summer of 1973, went under investigation by the U.S. Attorney's Office because when he was a Maryland County executive, he took bribes, he extorted people, he was corrupt, he used monetary influence. And then he made it worse. Rather than defending himself, rather than, just out and out resigning, he goes to the president and says, Richard Nixon, will you stop the attorney's office from investigating me? Well, Nixon sure as hell can't do that. So Agnew is forced to resign, October the 9th, 1973. So now it's continually looking like, okay, well, who's not corrupt in the Nixon administration? Well, the answer to that is this guy, Gerald Ford, House Minority Leader, and appointed by Richard Nixon to be Vice President of the United States. Which also meant that on Nixon's resigning, Gerald Ford becomes the only president in American history never to have been elected. Nobody votes for Gerald Ford other than being a representative of the United States of America. Now, in part, Nixon did this because he thought, okay, well, Ford, you're the number 2 man in the country now. You'll show a little bit of gratitude. You'll show some gratitude if all of this scandal goes to light. But the fact is, Ford is, at heart, legitimately a good president. Admittedly, and I'll show some Saturday Night Live skits probably tomorrow, because it was with Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter in the 76 election. That's when Saturday Night Live really started dabbling into election cycle politics. And they lampooned the fact that Ford fell down a lot, was clumsy, and was not the smartest guy on the planet. But Ford was at least honest. And even Ford, as immortalized in this cartoon, has no problem stabbing Nixon in the back saying, no, you have to hand over everything related to Watergate. The scandal keeps going on and on and on, but not really getting anywhere. Until these 2 journalists, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein of the Washington Post, they're reporters, and they get a hot tip, okay, from a guy named Mark Felt. And what these guys did is they reported on the various disruption tactics. They reported, okay, what are the plumbers doing? What is Creep doing? Things like that. And then Mark Felt, codenamed Deep Throat, which, Deep Throat was the name of a very popular pornographic movie of the era. I'm not going to tell you what it means, but there's a reason I found a picture of Mark Felt with his mouth open. And he basically was a member of the FBI, and he leaked information saying that, look, here's what Nixon did, here are details of the cover-up, here's what we know, here's where the president has probably broken the law. So Bernstein and Woodward, being good reporters, break the story. This immediately shifts public opinion. And now Congress demands an investigation. Okay? One of the things that, why Watergate is so, I think, important to American history is it shows that the system works. In his words, Richard Nixon said that it's not illegal when the president does it. But Watergate proves otherwise. Watergate proves that even the president of the United States is not above the law. And so the branches can work together. Congress can investigate. Then eventually the Supreme Court can say you must hand over the tapes. And two branches can oust. Now that's not to say that some parts of the government don't work. I'm sure many of you are overjoyed that Clinton hasn't been charged with the email scandal. I'm sure many of you are disappointed. And I'm not talking about individual, parts of the government, but I am saying the check and balances system of Congress and the Supreme Court being a check against the executive. Watergate proves that that system works. In February, House Resolution 803 said, okay, impeachment charges are warranted. Then July 24, 1974, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled 8-0, one abstention, that Nixon had to turn over all tapes, all of those recording system tapes, that, everything, so that the House could go through it. What people supported Nixon, the support just evaporates. Because now it's, okay, wait a minute. If the president had nothing to hide, why would he be stonewalling on the tapes? Now you've got Congress saying that they should impeach. The Supreme Court says the president doesn't have a leg to stand on. And there were even some fears that Nixon was going to be so reluctant to quit the White House, were he to be impeached, that the 82nd Airborne Division, stationed in Washington, D.C., would have to forcibly remove him. I mean, quite literally, not quite civil war. And these are rumors, they're fears, but they never get that far. But I mean, this is a this is a nation in the throes of crisis. Finally, on August the 8th, exactly as the Hughes Gomar Explorer is raising a Soviet Golf-class ballistic missile submarine, Nixon resigns. He boards Marine One, flashes the peace symbol. I am not a crook. I did nothing wrong. Now, it might have died there. Okay, he has resigned from the presidency. He said he did nothing wrong. The system worked. But there's that whole issue of if he broke law, he could then be charged. Gerald Ford, in one of his first acts as president, pardons Richard Nixon. And how he says it, we pardon Richard Nixon for any crimes that may have been committed. He doesn't even say that crimes were committed, only that if they had been, you're pardoned. That's like saying, I pardon you if you stole something. If you hadn't stolen anything, I wouldn't need to pardon you. If Nixon hadn't done something wrong, he would not have needed a presidential pardon. And so from the very outset, a lot of people don't like Ford. Ford will try to run for president in his own right in 1976, and the ghost of Watergate will not die. Because a lot of people believe, as Dan Aykroyd playing Jimmy Carter in the Debate 76 skits on Saturday Night Live, and again, I'll post these tomorrow, forever denied the United States the justice of bringing Richard Nixon to trial. Ford becomes unpopular. And I mean, some people do like him, but Ford's also damned because the nation's been so caught up with the Cold War and so caught up with Nixon that things at home start to fall apart again. We tend to go in cycles in this nation. We'll do financially great one decade, then blah the next, then great the next, and blah the next. Well, the 60s weren't horrible, but the 70s sure as heck would be. 1973 in October, we once again see an Arab-Israeli war. Okay, this has been fairly common. You're going to have one in 48 when Israel becomes a state. You're going to have 1956 fighting over the Suez, 1967 the Six-Day War, then 1973 the Yom Kippur War. Here's a knocked out M48 patent. This would have been given to the Israelis by the United States. Okay, and why I mention it in this class is because now we're starting to develop a presence in the Middle East. We're starting to develop control in the Middle East, okay? And we see that now the United States we're bound, we really, out of the Yom Kippur, see the United States is bound by what happens in the Middle East. Now, this war doesn't even last a full month. And what more or less happens is the Arab League once again attack Israel to reclaim the Sinai Desert. This had originally been Egyptian, but the Egyptians lost this in the wake of the Six-Day War, and the Arab League wants it back. So, once again, despite Cold War détente, or the hopes of it, Soviet Union once again starts supplying its allies of Egypt and Syria and Iraq. We supply our allies of Israel, and, we're not supplying Jordan anymore, but we had at one point. Oops. And as in all of the other previous Arab-Israeli wars, Israel eventually starts getting the upper hand. And so Egypt, under Anwar Sadat, gets an idea. Okay? They say, wait a minute, let's try for a permanent peace solution here. But they realize that a permanent peace solution would have to be sympathetic to Israel and the United States. So what we see, they expel their Soviet advisors. Their army is being, it's equipped with Soviet tanks. Their troops are trained by the Soviets. Egypt expels them. The Egyptian army does horrible. Anwar Sadat then begins a dialogue with Nixon. And this starts putting in place a peace treaty, if you will, between Egypt and Israel. It doesn't solve what's going on in the Middle East, but it does start to create a more permanent peace solution. Now, as this is happening, okay, the United States economy is going to take a substantial hit. And the reason is, realizing that once again, many of these Arab countries, this is where world oil is being exported, right? They realize, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to realize who the number one backer of Israel is. That's us. And so if you want anybody to do anything, whether to do something or to stop them from doing something, you hit them in the pocketbook. So OPEC, the oil producing, nations, are going to start an oil embargo. And if you look, inflation, not, only really bad with, the height of the Vietnam War. It's down again. It spikes in 73. Then again in 79. And I mean, we have not seen this kind of inflation in 30 some odd years. Almost 40 years. But take high inflation, add that to the misery index, so inflation, unemployment. This was called, in this period, stagflation. Not only did you have rampant inflation, but the economy stagnates. And why? Because we supported Israel, and the Arab League doesn't like it. Now, the ironic thing is Nixon wants to mitigate an Israeli victory, because he realizes if Israel is probably the most technologically advanced power there. If they destroy the Arab League, take more land, it destabilizes the whole region. In 67, the Soviets had threatened, if Israel goes too far, that they would intervene. Okay? So at the same time, we're trying to get the Israelis, hey, don't take over everything. But we're still supporting them. OPEC, 5% cut in oil in October 17. We then give an aid package to Israel as we have to. The Saudi Arabia embargoes oil to the United States. And then OPEC continues It's cuts. I'll actually post a special report I usually show about this. World oil supplies fall by 10%. Okay. Within 7 years, gas prices triple. This is a huge hit. And we'll talk a bit more about the economic impact tomorrow. But understand, this is an economy driven by oil. Part of why the United States had done so well post-World War II is at the time we were the world's largest exporter, not importer, exporter of oil. That gave us a huge reserve with cheap gas prices. And think about it. You're driving to work, right? It costs you $1. Well, gas is probably 25 cents. So it costs you $2, $3 to fill up your tank for a couple of weeks. Okay? You don't have to pay a lot of money in that. But now if that's triple, okay, that's less money for food, that's less money you put into the economy, that hurts. If you look at oil prices, I don't know what price is. Apparently I went southern, y'all. Oil price, okay, it picks up in 74, then up again in 80. It drops by the mid-80s, but it never gets, if you look at this graph, it never gets below 1974 prices. It never does. We will never, and probably in our lifetimes, ever see prices that low again. You know, and now what is it? Gas drops to $1.50 or I don't think it's even $1. What is it? $1.75. And you're like, oh my goodness, it's cheap. Well, this has another thing. It triggers a run on oil. So much so, there wasn't enough fuel to go around. Gas stations would have to hold out, flags. If it's a green flag, everybody can get gas. If it's a yellow flag, only commercial. You had to prove you were a commercial vehicle and why you needed gas. And if it was a red, whether or not they had gas, the gas station would have to close and couldn't sell it. Odds are they probably didn't even have it. This becomes something that so many Americans can relate to, and things such as the gas line. People lining up for gas. Things like this. Sorry, no gas line. Or like these gas lines. That there were McDonald's commercials in the 70s. I'll post one of those too. Where one of their Big Macs, like, hey, you got nothing to do. Let's all just go get Big Macs because the car sure as heck ain't going anywhere. And so this leads to what we call stagflation. And this is also, in part, why Ford is going to have a hard time getting elected. You have budget deficits linked to Vietnam War. Oil prices quadruple. Gas prices are going to, increase. Ford, you've got a tax cut. That's just further hurting inflation. You have more and more people in the world. Okay? So what that means is now there's a global food shortage. Not necessarily in the United States, but worldwide there's a food shortage. And that, once again, hurts the economy. If you look at the cost of stuff, because remember, you say oil prices quadruple. But I say it takes until 1980 for gas prices to triple. Because when the oil price rises, okay, when you buy gas, a lot of that is taxes, stuff like that. But oil ripples through everything. Okay, plastics, cost of production of stuff, cost of shipping stuff. So things like a loaf of bread, which used to be 25 to 30 cents, now costs over $1. Milk doubles in prices. Home prices skyrocket. Food prices skyrocket. Suddenly, money that in January of 1973 could have bought you a heck of a lot of stuff, the purchasing power is now shrunk to a third, and so the economy stagnates. You can't buy as much stuff, people don't make it, businesses don't make much money. Hello layoffs, hello unemployment. You start producing less stuff, high prices, and you can't afford it. And then as gas prices increase, further, the money becomes worthless. And so the American economy in the mid-70s grinds to a halt. And it's continually driven by this embargo. Gas prices will double within weeks, and it takes a bit longer for it to finally triple. It costs money now to heat your home. Well, even more, I should say. Now, the embargo does end in March 74. Hitting someone in the pocketbook is twofold. I don't sell over to them, I teach you a lesson, but then I don't get the money. But the problem is this stagnation leads to an energy crisis. By 1970, so years before this happened, the United States was responsible for 40% of the world's energy consumption. We're quite greedy. And now it's the realization and a loss of consumer confidence that at any time, because we're now tied to foreign oil, if somebody embargoes it or stops it or whatever, that triggers just a huge energy crisis. Why? Because our economy is tied to oil. And now we're not the world's largest exporter. We're not even an exporter. Now we become one of the largest importers of oil. And so what this now means, okay, if we didn't already, now we have to be tied in to the Middle East, because that's where most of the oil is. So now that's why we don't want, terrorist factions, coming up. We don't want, destabilization. We don't want wars that will cut off that supply of oil, because this, our economy is tied to the stuff. The GNP, the gross national product, is able to double between 1950 and 1973 because of cheap energy, because of cheap gas prices. But now, as the cost of everything goes up, food shortages across the world, the great inflation and economic stagflation, the American economy grinds to a halt. This is the first big reversal of that post-war trend. Yeah, we talked about the recession in the 50s that triggers Kennedy to want to do more to close the rich-poor gap. But even though there had been a brief recession, the economy still marched forward. But this is a clear reversal. And so what we're going to see is the 70s, the tangible woes of the 70s, building on top of the political woes of the 60s, meant that in the 80s, there was a struggle to find out what went wrong and how can this trend be reversed. We're not going to get there yet, but we'll pick up more talking about, economic impacts and, what this kind of stuff meant for the American economy and how, that's going to shape up the presidencies of Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter. So as always, if you've got any questions, let me know. If you have not yet taken your exam and you have not yet talked to me about it, do so ASAP. Needless to say, you cannot really pass the class not taking 1/3 of the exam. So please let me know as soon as you can. If there's anything I can do, just give me a shout. And as always, I'll see you in the next video. All right, bye-bye.